It's the most impossible question, the most impossible thing to do. It's impossible. I don't have a good answer for this. I guess the hard worker in me is always trying to think like, what's the thing that I haven't solved for that if I was able to solve for would make this idea a success? And I think this is probably the same problem as any designer or any founder has. Like, how much effort do you sink into an idea before you say it's, not something worth going after?
Today, I'm joined by Shane Burford, Head of Design at Car Group, best known for carsales.com.au. Shane's pioneered a four-step process to launch new ventures globally and even aims for a 50% failure rate to unlock next-level product innovation.
Welcome to All Things Design, the podcast where I speak to top design leaders about how design drives digital transformations. I'm Joe Woodham, founder of Tory, Australia's leading design consultancy. We work with top brands to embed amazing designers into their teams. Our designers create experiences that millions of people use every day.
Thanks for joining us today, Shane.
Great to be here.
You're currently the head of design at Car Group. Did you want to give us a bit more of a background into, I guess, your role and the Car Group?
Yeah, for sure. So Car Group is a company probably not many people have heard of. It's the parent company of carsales.com.au in Australia and also owns websites across the world. In Brazil, we own a website called Web Motors and assets in South Korea and Chile as well. Our business is really structured around building marketplaces that enable people to buy vehicles. There's a big trend in marketplaces generally toward trying to support the broader transaction that users are trying to achieve when they're looking at different stock items.
If you're enjoying today's video, please make sure you hit subscribe and give us a like so other people like yourself can find the video and get some value from it.
That's really what my team is trying to explore, which is the broader transaction experience for our customers. My role specifically within that is the new ventures area, brand new businesses. We're really tasked with looking at the riskier problem spaces, the areas where success isn't guaranteed, but if we can work it out, the upside for the business is significant. So we've started with a relatively safe bet, exploring a new marketplace opportunity, which is live now. We've very recently launched a payments experience, which was focused on solving the pain point of a private buyer and seller paying each other. Apparently today, like most of the time, those payments fail and it's really painful if you're involved in that transaction. And, looking toward the future, we're working on a lot of newer sort of opportunities that are perhaps a bit more risky than the ones I've mentioned.
It must be quite fun getting to work on the riskier ideas. But even with let's say the payments one that you just mentioned, if you can get that working, do you roll that across all of the brands globally or is it specifically designed for one brand at a time?
Yeah, really good question. So we are a team that is focused on all the sort of businesses globally. So we only work on opportunity areas that can scale. Payments is luckily something that happens in every country, so naturally scales quite well. But we do focus locally to start with. So following sort of like a Six Sigma model, get one core variation right, get it working in one market, and then scale the learnings and the technology across different marketplaces globally. Interestingly, with payments, we started talking to our business in Brazil about how we can scale it there. And it's just really interesting to hear about the different pain points that they have around the risk of, if you go on a test drive, the car getting stolen. For that business, scaling some of that sort of safety technology that would have to build for that business to Australia will also benefit the Australian market. So it's good to have a global lens that allows us to sort of stress test the solutions and make them stronger, I think.
Very cool. It's definitely different markets and different problems. They seem similar if you looked at it from a financial perspective, we're looking to build a payments platform, but obviously different markets, very different problems if you're looking at Brazil versus Australia. What does that funnel look like? Where are your ideas coming from and how do you validate them to go, this is something this team is going to focus on for the next X amount of time? I imagine that there's a whole heap of different challenges coming from different regions. What's your process?
We have a 4-step process, identify problems. When we do that, we go to sort of conferences, look at emerging technology, but we also try to work with the different businesses globally to try and understand what their pain points are. And then we consolidate that into a series of opportunity areas. We've got like a one-pager which is perhaps similar in nature to what Amazon do with press release, trying to define what the problem space is, but also what we think the big opportunity is. And I guess one difference between my team of designers and perhaps design more generally is that I really try and push my designers to take a product thinking approach to opportunities. So I think often when I've worked with designers in the past, we're really good at thinking about the customer problem, like what's the user-centric problem, which is great because we need to do that. Otherwise, we're definitely not going to design a good solution. But I also am really pushing my designers to think about, what's the market potential for a solution like that? What's our likelihood of being able to actually create something valuable and differentiated in that sort of space to then enable us to sort of really stress test ideas as we're going through that early stage of identifying ideas. We've got a committee who approve our ideas. It's the CEO, CFO, and CIO. They approve our different ideas. And then we go into a 12-week sort of design thinking approach to explore the opportunity space. The outcome of that is a pitch for funding if we think the idea has legs. And then once we go through the pitch process, assuming it's successful, which it was with payments, which is good, is although it doesn't have to be, we have a 50% fail rate is our goal. We think if we're not failing at least half the time, then we're not pushing ourselves hard enough. And then we go into incubating the idea, which is really using a sort of a lean startup approach to design. So trying to push out experiments as fast as possible, explore different ideas for getting to our growth metric, and then, pivoting the solution to ultimately arrive at the outcome that we want. And then at the end, unfortunately, we get to hand off the baby to one of the sort of countries where we're building the solution, which is a bit sad, but, we exist as a team that's focused on exploring ideas right from the initial idea right through to getting it live, and then we hand it off to the core business.
So much to unpack there, but let's rewind where you started, which is where the budgets come from. You said you work with the CFO, the CEO, and the CTO, was it?
Yep.
And you're getting that's where the sort of funding the problem initially comes from. First of all, how did you, is it just you communicating? Does your team also communicate with them in terms of the pitches and talking about where you're up to or the ideas or the validation? How did you cross that bridge in being able to communicate from a designer that communicates in a certain way to being able to speak to the business and understand what the business requirements are to be able to sort of work with them and take them on that journey?
So the team that explores the ideas in a design thinking led approach at the start is made up of a designer, product manager, and also technology representative. Depending on the idea, we also get people from the core business as well, if it's appropriate. And so we craft our pitches in a way so we break up the task of crafting the pitch. But best example of a pitch I've ever come across, I'm sure there's better examples, but the original Airbnb one is amazing because it sort of outlines, and this is the structure that we follow, it sort of outlines the broader market opportunity, the customer problem, the design territory, then the solution or what we're hoping to achieve, and then finishes with the funding ask or what we need next to be able to progress the idea and what we think success will look like. And so it's about 10 pages, not particularly difficult to do, but we sort of divide and conquer the work between those three roles to be able to get it done. And then when we're in the pitching with the C-suite, we sort of tag team that. So I'll talk to the customer needs and the solution, and my colleague will talk to the market potential and the funding ask to be able to deliver it.
Do you find that obviously being able to communicate at that level really enables you to do better work because you're able to speak directly to where the source is coming from?
Definitely. Yeah. And I think the most useful thing that this role has taught me is the types of questions that the leadership team ask, which are perhaps different to the ones that I certainly would have thought about as a designer. My C-suite are really interested in understanding the customer problem. They want to know that we're working on things that are impactful. The reason for that is to be able to explain car sales is a growth stock. People buy Car Group to have it increase in price over the years rather than a dividend stock. We need to be able to communicate to the market how we're going to deliver that growth. If we can communicate the key sort of ways that we're solving customer problems, then that translates for our C-suite in having amazing stories for how we're going to achieve growth in the future. So yeah, it's interesting and then that enables me to think about, oh, how do I craft this story into a way that's, able to be understood and also perhaps retranslated for, a shareholder presentation. In the last GM, we had the last slide, which was all about our payment solutions.
How has your communication style changed? Like you go from being a designer to having to communicate the C-suite. I imagine since taking on this role and being able to communicate at that level, a lot's changed in your communication style. What's changed for you? And then how do you, I guess, take your team on that journey as well?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. I haven't really reflected on it in significantly, I guess, but it is feedback that we talk about as a team now that we have quite a large team delivering this product. Sometimes I think in product generally, and I guess design is part of that, we like to talk about what we're doing. And so I say to the team, you're talking to talk at the moment. And so we're talking to, say we're working on this feature or that feature or whatever. That's fine. Sometimes there's a time and place for it. What I encourage them to do is talk to be heard. So trying to understand the stakeholder needs and making sure that we're sort of crafting our story around how the product is going, what features we're trying to work on to appeal to the audience that's going to be listening to it. It's exactly the same message. It's just optimizing it so that it can actually be heard rather than just go over other people's head. We work in an organization that has a lot of digital technology, so a lot of people on Zoom, let's face it, probably multitasking. Making sure that we're being intentional about our communication is really important. We actually did a stakeholder needs workshop with the whole team where we talked through all the different stakeholders that come to our showcases. And we talked about, okay, for each of these stakeholder types, like what are they trying to get from this solution? What do they want to walk away from the showcase with? And then we mapped out the agenda of a current showcase. And we're like, okay, so if we were to make it work for these needs that we've just mapped for each of these different stakeholder types, how would we optimize the message? Then we're able to optimize the message around, these are our metrics of success. This is the initiatives and how they tie into the metrics of success and ultimately have a much more successful sort of showcase where we get much better feedback. So yeah, encouraging the team to be heard, I guess, rather than just talking for the sake of it.
I think it's it's well put, speaking to be heard as opposed to just speaking. Let's talk about, you mentioned that you aim for a 50% success rate. Let's talk about validating a product. How long do you give each process to go, we know that 50% is going to work, 50% is not going to work. So we've got a specific runway. How do we move through this runway to validate this and continue on with the product or stop?
Yeah. So for when we're in the incubation stage, so we've got an idea, we've got some funding to go and explore it further and bring something to market. We have a ritual, which is every 6 weeks, discuss the project, how it's going, and make a pivot, persevere, or perish decision at the end of that. That's just straight out of the lean startup approach. But we have, I guess part of the funding process, we sort of agree on a metric that we're going for. In the case of payments, that was penetration of private listings. So we wanted to get to lots and lots of people using the product. Then every sort of 6 weeks, we're assessing how are we going to that and are we making the right decisions to be able to get us there. Naturally, with a metric like that, that forces us to restructure our thinking and the initiatives that we're working on around things that grow the funnels bigger as opposed to maybe converting more people through the funnel. We're really trying to fail in the small things through the project so that we can be successful at the end. An example is, we want to grow the funnel. Initially, we thought that it would be important for sellers to opt in to be paid through the platform. And that resulted in about 40% of sellers not opting in. So we had this idea, remove the requirement to opt in. Terrifying, because sellers could get really annoyed at us if they get paid through car sales without opting into being paid. What we did there was we did user testing. Sellers didn't really care. Then we also launched to a small subset of the market, one state, and they didn't really care either. So then we rolled it out to the whole country. So maybe that's an example of a successful one, trying to fail as early as possible so that by the time we get to the end, we've hopefully pivoted our way to a successful way to solve that problem.
Can you talk me through maybe a small failure that you were able to learn from really quick and then pivot, change the metric? And
Yeah, there's some, well, I can talk through one that hasn't really worked as well as I would have liked, but we haven't necessarily got a pathway to solve it yet. But this payments product enables private buyers and sellers to transact through our platform. We know that a lot of our sellers are dual listing, so they use multiple marketplaces when they're trying to sell their car. They just want to get it sold as quickly as possible. And so we wanted sellers who are interacting with people from another marketplace, for example, maybe on a test drive, to have the ability to bring that buyer back into our platform, seeing the listing on car sales previously. So we created a QR code. The seller gets shown to the buyer and they can scan it and make an offer and make payment on the spot. It has gotten used, but it just hasn't been the knock out of the park success that we would have liked. And that's something that we're currently iterating.
makes sense though. Like from a security perspective, if you can use a trusted platform as opposed to an untested platform, makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. We need to deep dive into why that is not the knock out of the park success that it should be, in my opinion, as well.
So how does, like, I guess going through this, do you have to go back to the C-level to get more funding at certain stages to go, hey, we feel like we've overachieved these metrics or underachieved these metrics. This is what we think the next step will be. And what does that look like? Do you go back in with your product team, so product manager and the technical person, to go, this is where we're up to, this is what's working, this is what's not working, and this is how we think moving forward's going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, just speaking from the payments product, maybe specifically, because the example that I've talked about so far, we actually thought that would be a much more formal process. It's actually turned into quite an informal process where we just talk through the budget and where we're at. And because it's going quite well, funding has not really been an issue. But I would suspect that if the initiative wasn't going to plan, then that would be a much more detailed discussion.
So like, I guess on that journey of validating product, sometimes you might validate that an idea is not going to work pretty quickly. Do you just go back to the drawing board and go, all right, it's been 6 weeks. I think we've worked out this isn't going to work. Let's move on to the next thing in the pipeline. What does that look like from a team perspective? Or do you just go straight back to the top of the task list pile and next idea?
Yes. It's the most impossible question, the most impossible thing to do. It's impossible. I don't have a good answer for this because it's just, I guess the hard worker in me is always trying to think like, what's the thing that I haven't solved for that if I was able to solve for would make this idea a success? I think this is probably the same problem as any designer or any founder has. Like, how much effort do you sink into an idea before you say it's not something worth going? I think for all the ideas that we've explored so far, I think we're up to like 4 or 5. The most valuable step in the process was validating the customer need upfront. Because if the customer need exists, then there's a way. With the payments product, that was terrifying at the start. The amount of regulatory overhead that a marketplace business has to consider is a lot. What if we lost the money and had to pay for someone's car? And will the technology actually work? What if money is just sitting somewhere and we don't know when the buyer or the seller is not able to complete the transaction? Understanding that the problem space is something that users need solved. Users need a way to more effectively pay each other, and they need to verify that they're not getting scammed. Knowing that means that, at least in my mind, I think there's always going to be a pathway to pivoting to a successful product. It's just a question of how. So I guess that gives me the confidence to be able to say, like, whatever we fail in, we'll be able to figure it out. Yeah. I think the more challenging one for me right now is, I won't go into details on the product, but it's like there's a question around not just is it a problem for the user to solve, but is it a valuable problem for the user to have solved? But also, do we have a right as Car Group to solve it?
Yeah.
That's a really difficult one as well. Yet that goes to the fundamentals of, what is your core business and what should we be doing, which is, I guess, more of a strategy question.
How do you look at like maybe the return on it? Like if we do actually work out how to solve this problem, how much is it going to cost us to solve it? And what's going to be the return to the business? Because it might solve a small friction point, but like, is that going to be
Worth the effort for the
Yeah.
business? We think about this right at the start, is part of the pitching process, is even part of the idea process. We think about it in a similar way to our startups think about problems to solve, which is, what's the total addressable market and the obtainable market? We start to think about that right from the start. So even if there is a large market, the question is, can we actually make money or generate value for the business out of that? And we develop hypotheses about that before we even go to pitching with like real numbers of what we think the benefit could be. With payments, I'd say like the categories of value have maybe shifted, but we're still delivering a lot of value for the business.
like, let's go. You've validated the idea. Like you understand it's going to make an impact. Do you have to go pitch it to each individual business? So let's say you're working in car sales and you go, hey, we've solved this problem. We need you to implement it. Like, is there any friction point between you guys coming up with ideas and then trying to implement them back into the businesses?
Yeah, that's an important one to solve, which I think is something that we'll always be working on as a opportunity area to solve for. I was inspired actually on this topic by the HBR book on innovation. I think it was released last year, because they spent almost a whole book talking about this topic of how innovation teams can work with broader businesses for success. I think this is something that is a really strong muscle of design that perhaps isn't well enough utilized. So what we did was the broader business was involved from day one. We learnt from the business about the pain points. We brought them on the journey for co-design. We pitched to them as well as the C-suite. We pitched them before the C-suite, and we got them aligned on the problem and aligned on the solution in a very traditional sort of co-design type way. If you've got the business that you're building the product for initially on board with the solve, then it's quite straightforward for you to then say, and now we're going to solve the problem, and it's not even going to hit your cost line. So here's the solution. You're welcome. And it allowed us to position the work that we were solving for the broader business as almost like a gift. But I don't think we would have gotten to that point had we not brought the business along on the journey from the start. Yeah, we've from the start used the design thinking sort of methodology for bringing the business on board. But, you can imagine, for a payments product, like if we didn't bring the risk team, for example, on board from the very first design, or we didn't introduce it to the board from the very start, then there would have been a lot of friction along that journey.
Like, your role sounds so interesting. Like, it is not your straightforward design role. And I feel like if I was to do a startup again, if I could have a team like you validating everything before you actually go to market, like the difference that must make in cost saving across all of the brands for Car Group must be amazing. Are you able to measure that? Like in terms of, because they're using this your team, which is an external team to everything, how much more effective you are at solving those problems?
That's a really interesting question. We haven't, but I'm sure there's a way we could.
It's been an interesting stat because, like, in any large business, right? Like, usually it's slow to get things done, but because you're sitting outside that business, you'll be able to make decisions quicker and move faster. So it'd be very interesting to validate.
I mean, in terms of just speed to market, we were able to stand up a solution from funding to launch within like 6 or 7 months. So it was very quick. So you're right, like that's absolutely true. I think the broader sort of business sees that, but I think the real benefit's going to be when we scale internationally. And we've already got the core technology to roll it out in another country. They can just have some iterations that are relevant to their market, but not have to build the product from scratch.
Would you build the core product and then they go through their legal stuff, whatever they need to do in their own region to be able to get it to market?
We'll work with the business to figure out what the features they need are to launch those features. And then they will work with legal and their risk team talking about the regulation of the local region to optimize it for that area.
Interesting. So like, let's say like for me, there's so many takeaways, like as a business owner and from a design perspective, there's so many great takeaways in terms of the structure and how you guys approach things. Let's say, what are some of your biggest learnings since starting with Car Group, from going from like a design role at a place like, let's say, Telstra, to where you are now, where it's kind of very different? Like, what are some of the biggest learnings that you've had?
Yeah, I think the main one is having empathy. You know, like as designers, we're taught to have empathy for our customers, right?
Yep.
And we do research, we understand their pain points, we solve them. Amazing, right? But I think the big takeaway for me was having empathy for my stakeholders, because a product manager, for example, is trying to achieve the same goal from a different perspective. And so if you can understand what that role is trying to achieve, then you're more able to work together, you know, understanding the total addressable market, understanding how we're going to generate revenue. By understanding that, I can then use that to optimize how we do the product. And we can both be working toward new feature ideas that are addressing those goals. I think that is, I guess, the aspiration of any sort of designer working in a triad or a quad. I think sometimes it's harder to achieve it in practice. And also understanding, having empathy for the needs of the leadership team who are absorbing this solution. Yeah, understanding that, you know, for my leadership team, they need to have great stories of growth for the market. And if I can help, by understanding that, I can help to package up my work in that context so that it's more successful. So I think that's the first one. I think the second one is, in design, I think a traditional design methodology has, a research approach, some initial design, user testing, and then, launching of a product. I think when I look at the different initiatives that we've looked at Car Group, that's great. But some of the biggest findings that we've had have been from different data sources that I would have never thought about previously. We got this amazing finding that 94% of people have a bank transfer fail when they're transacting privately. If we just had the qual, that's a great story. But saying 94% of people have a bank transfer fail, that's much stronger as a message. Combining those methods and we used a fake door test as well. So we launched just an ad placement on our site. People clicked on it, took them to a landing page for our product. We had multiple versions of what the product would be, and using that as a data source to help us to figure out like what features are valuable for our users. I think as a designer, we have a really great toolkit, and thinking through the lean startup approach to exploring ideas, there's a few additional tools that we can add.
Yeah. Great takeaways. But I think empathy with stakeholders, designers do have a great toolkit. And I think that's one thing that designers, once they move through maybe a little bit more seniority or leadership, really need to understand that business acumen side, how to communicate back to stakeholders or C-level suite. Because I guess that's where the money comes from, right? Like it's all good if you're focusing on the users, but you kind of have to prove back to the business the return on investment. So
yeah, I think the good thing for design is you're already doing that. It's just a language problem, So yeah.
Interesting. I think there's a bit of a market gap there. Someone needs to start a training course that kind of just takes designers on that journey of how to communicate at that level. Because I think there's not much out there, and it's kind of a hard thing to learn if you haven't been put in that situation, like your role where you've kind of been thrust into it, right? But Shane, it was an absolute pleasure speaking to you. It's been fascinating to hear about your role at Car Group and I guess the cool things that you get to work on. if anyone wants to reach out and connect with you, what's the best way? Like reach out on LinkedIn?
Yeah, LinkedIn would be great. Yep. And yeah, always happy to chat, have a coffee, catch up or what have you. So yeah, feel free to reach out.
Amazing. Shane, once again, it was an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Jerry. Have a good one.
That's it for today's episode. Now, if you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure you hit subscribe. Also, leave us a comment and a like. It helps people like yourself find this video.